The first bullet shattered the front window of Margot's bakery at 6:17 a.m., sending crystalline fragments across the marble countertop where she'd been arranging fresh croissants. The second bullet struck the vintage espresso machine, releasing a hiss of steam that mixed with the scent of fear and gunpowder. Margot Beaumont didn't flinch. Instead, she moved with a fluid precision that seemed almost choreographed, her flour-dusted apron billowing as she dropped behind the counter and reached for something hidden beneath the register. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning had started like any other in the war-torn city of Levant. Margot had risen at 4 a.m., her calloused hands working through the familiar rhythm of kneading dough, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for the past 15 years. The bakery, nestled between a bombed-out bookstore and a makeshift clinic, had become an unlikely sanctuary in a neighborhood where hope was as scarce as fresh bread. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been the first customer that morning, her medical scrubs still stained from the night shift at the clinic next door. She'd pushed through the bakery's heavy oak door with the exhausted shuffle of someone who'd seen too much suffering, her dark eyes reflecting the weight of lives lost and saved in equal measure. The usual Margot? Elena had asked, though. They both knew the answer. 2 pain au chocolate and a double espresso, black. It was their morning ritual, a small comfort in a world that had forgotten the meaning of comfort. Margot had smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. Of course, Mia, though today I made something special. She gestured toward a display case where a small cake sat like a jewel among the pastries. 3 layers of vanilla, sponged with buttercream roses so delicate they seemed to breathe with life. It's Tommy's birthday, 16 years old today. Tommy Castellano had been sweeping the sidewalk outside his family's shuttered restaurant when the conversation began. At 16, he carried himself with the premature gravity of someone who'd grown up during wartime, but his face still held traces of boyish innocence. His family's restaurant had closed 2 years ago when his father was killed by shrapnel from a mortar round, leaving Tommy, his mother, and his younger sister to survive on whatever odd jobs they could find. You didn't have to do that, Mrs. Beaumont, Tommy had said when he saw the cake, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. We can't afford. Nonsense, Margot had interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to caring for others. Birthdays are sacred, especially here, especially now. She'd wrapped the cake in a pristine white box, her movements deliberate and careful. Besides, you've been keeping my sidewalk clean for months. Consider it payment. The lie was kind and necessary. Tommy had never asked for payment, just as Margot had never offered it. But in a city where pride was often all people had left, such gentle deceptions were acts of love. Father Miguel Santos had arrived next, his black robes dusty from the morning walk through rubble-strewn streets. At 68, he'd seen the city transform from a bustling commercial hub to a battlefield, and his sermons had evolved from salvation to survival. The small wooden cross he wore had been crafted from debris of the original church, destroyed in the war's early days. The children are asking about the reading program again, he'd said to Margot, accepting the bag of day-old bread she always prepared for the orphanage. They miss their books, Margot had nodded thoughtfully. The city's library had been bombed 6 months ago, and with it, hundreds of children's books had been reduced to ash in memory. I've been thinking about that, she'd replied. What if we cleared out the back room, made it a small reading space? The conversation had been interrupted by the distant rumble of artillery, a sound that had become as common as morning birdsong. They'd paused, listening, gauging the distance and direction, with the practiced ears of longtime residents. Far enough away to continue their day, close enough to remember that safety was always temporary. It was then that Margot had noticed the small, leather-bound notebook that had fallen from Father Miguel's pocket. She bent to retrieve it, and, as she handed it back, their fingers had touched briefly. The priest's eyes had searched her face with a curiosity that spoke of long-held questions and careful observations. "You know, Margot," he'd said quietly, "I've always wondered about your hands. They're remarkably steady for someone who spent 15 years decorating cakes." Margot's smile had faltered for just a moment, a crack in the carefully maintained facade she'd built around herself. "Steady hands make for better roses," she'd replied, but something in her voice had changed, becoming more guarded. The truth was that Margot's hands had been steady long before she'd ever touched a piping bag. Before the flour and sugar, before the early morning baking sessions and the gentle conversations with customers who'd become family, her hands had held different tools. Heavier tools. Tools that required a different kind of precision. The bakery itself held secrets woven into its very foundation. Built in 1923, it had survived 2 previous conflicts, its thick stone walls and reinforced basement serving as shelter for countless families over the decades. Hidden behind a false wall in the storage room was a chamber that few knew existed, a remnant from the building's wartime past, complete with ventilation systems and sight lines that offered perfect views of the surrounding streets. When Margot had purchased the building 15 years ago, she discovered this hidden room along with a collection of items that the previous owner had left behind. Military maps, still current despite their age. Communication equipment, carefully maintained and occasionally updated. And most significantly, a rifle case containing a weapon that seemed to call to something deep in her muscle memory. The morning's normalcy had continued for another hour. Regular customers had come and gone. Mrs. Chun collecting her husband's medication from the clinic while picking up fresh bread rolls. Young Maria Santos helping her grandmother navigate the cracked sidewalks while carrying a box of Margot's famous empanadas. Old Mr. Kowalski sharing stories of his youth while savoring a cup of coffee that reminded him of better times. But normality in Levant was always fragile. And at 6:17 a.m., it shattered along with the bakery's front window. The sniper's position was clear to Margot, immediately 3rd floor of the partially destroyed office building across the street. Northwest corner window. The angle of the bullet's trajectory, the timing between shots, the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure rather than people. It all painted a picture of a professional attempting to create fear and chaos rather than immediate casualties. As she crouched behind the counter, her hand found the hidden panel she'd installed years ago. Inside was a communication device, ancient by modern standards, but still functional. Her fingers moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, sending out a coded signal that hadn't been used in over a decade. "This is Nightingale," she whispered into the device, using a call sign that belonged to a different life, a different version of herself. "I have a hostile sniper, civilian area. Requesting immediate assessment of threat level and rules of engagement." The response crackled through the small speaker almost immediately. "Nightingale, this is Overwatch. Confirm your current status. Are you compromised?" Margot's laugh was bitter and quiet. Compromise didn't begin to cover it. For 15 years, she'd built a life around the simple act of creating sweetness in a world that had forgotten the taste of it. She'd become a pillar of her community, a source of comfort and stability for people who desperately needed both. The idea of revealing her true nature, of showing the neighborhood she'd grown to love that their gentle baker was something entirely different, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd worked to build. But as another bullet struck the wall above her head, sending plaster raining down onto her shoulders, Margot realized that her carefully constructed world was crumbling whether she acted or not. Through the shattered window, she could see Tommy Castellano frozen in terror on the sidewalk, still holding his birthday cake. Dr. Vasquez was pressed against the clinic's doorway, shouting for her patients to get to the basement. Father Miguel had dropped to his knees behind an overturned car, clutching his wooden cross and whispering prayers. These were her people. This was her chosen family, and someone was threatening them. "Overwatch, I am not compromised," Margot replied, her voice growing steady and cold. "But I'm about to be." She ended the communication and moved toward the hidden chamber behind the storage room. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the rifle case, not from fear, but from the weight of crossing a line she'd promised herself she would never cross again. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, like meeting an old friend after years of separation. As she climbed the narrow stairs that led to the building's upper floor, Margot caught her reflection in a cracked mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger gone, was the gentle baker with flour-dusted cheeks and warm, welcoming eyes. In her place stood someone harder, more focused, with the cold precision of a predator preparing to hunt. But the question that echoed in her mind, as she reached the window overlooking the sniper's position, wasn't about tactics or angles or wind. Speed. It was simpler and infinitely more complex. After 15 years of creating life and sweetness and joy, could she remember how to deal in death? The answer would reshape everything she'd built, everyone she'd come to love, and the very foundation of the person she'd convinced herself she'd become. As Margot settled into position, her finger finding the trigger with muscle memory that transcended time, she realized that some parts of ourselves can be buried but never truly forgotten. And in that moment, with her community under threat and her secret about to be revealed, Margaret "One-Shot" Beaumont prepared to remember exactly who she used to be. The transformation from Margot, the baker, to Margaret, the sniper, hadn't happened in an instant, despite how it might have appeared to anyone watching from the street below. It was a process that began in the smallest details. The way her breathing automatically regulated into the controlled rhythm she'd been trained to maintain. The way her pulse slowed despite the adrenaline. The way her world narrowed to the precise mathematics of wind, distance, and time. But even as her body remembered its old disciplines, her mind wrestled with the weight of 15 years lived as someone else entirely. She'd come to Levant in 2008, carrying nothing but a falsified passport, a small inheritance she'd accumulated through channels best left unexamined, and a bone-deep exhaustion that came from years of living in shadows. The war was already raging then, but it was a different kind of conflict, more contained, more predictable. She'd chosen the bakery not for its strategic position or its hidden chambers, but because it represented everything her previous life had lacked: creation instead of destruction, nurturing instead of elimination, community instead of isolation. The first year had been the hardest. Her hands, so steady when holding a rifle, had trembled constantly when attempting to pipe delicate decorations onto wedding cakes. She'd burned more loaves than she'd sold, had broken 3 mixing bowls through sheer nervousness, and had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering if she was deluding herself about the possibility of genuine change. But gradually, through repetition and determination, she'd learned to find the same meditative focus in baking that she'd once found in her previous profession. The precision required to create perfect layers, the patience needed to let dough rise properly, the gentle touch necessary to handle delicate pastries. These skills had slowly become as natural to her as breathing. Mrs. Chun had been one of her first regular customers, back when the elderly Chinese woman's husband was still alive and walking. They'd bonded over shared recipes, with Mrs. Chun teaching Margot to make traditional mooncakes, while Margot shared the secrets of French pastry techniques she'd learned during a long-ago assignment in Lyon. "You have sad eyes," Mrs. Chun had observed one morning, about 6 months after Margot had opened the bakery, "but your hands make happy food. This is an unusual thing." Margot had deflected the comment with humor, as she'd learned to do with all personal observations, but the old woman's words had stayed with her. In quiet moments, she'd found herself wondering if happiness could truly be created by someone who'd spent years dealing in its opposite, or if she was simply an elaborate fraud, temporarily fooling herself and everyone around her. The answer had come gradually, in moments so small they might have been overlooked by someone less accustomed to paying attention to details. The first time she'd successfully created a birthday cake that brought tears of joy to a child's eyes. The morning she'd found Tommy Castellano sleeping in her doorway during a particularly heavy bombing, and had wordlessly opened the bakery, early to give him a warm place to stay. The evening she'd sat with Dr. Vasquez after a particularly difficult day at the clinic, sharing pastries and wine while listening to stories of lives saved and lost. These moments had accumulated like layers in a cake, creating something substantial and nourishing. She'd begun to believe that perhaps redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building something beautiful on top of it. Her daily routine had become a form of meditation. Every morning at 4 a.m., she'd begin with the bread, simple, essential, foundational. The rhythm of kneading helped quiet the hypervigilance that was her unwelcome inheritance from years of combat. As the bread baked, filling the air with warmth and the promise of sustenance, she'd move on to the more delicate work, croissants that required precise temperature control, pastries that demanded gentle handling, cakes that were canvases for edible art. She developed relationships with her suppliers that went beyond mere business transactions. Santos, the elderly man who delivered her flour, had fought in 3 different wars and recognized in Margot a fellow veteran, though he'd never pressed for details. Instead, they'd talk about the weather, about football, about anything except the scars they both carried. Maria, the young woman who brought fresh eggs from her family's chickens, reminded Margot of herself at 19, determined, fearless, and utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of the world. The bakery had become more than a business. It was a gathering place, a neutral ground where people from different neighborhoods and backgrounds could meet safely. Margot had instituted a policy of never asking questions about where her customers came from or which side of the conflict they supported. All that mattered within her walls was basic human decency and the universal need for sustenance and comfort. She'd learned the names of dozens of children, had memorized their favorite treats, had created elaborate birthday cakes for families who couldn't afford elaborate anything else. When supplies were scarce, she'd stretch what she had to make sure no child left empty-handed. When money was tight for her customers, she'd suddenly develop an excess of day-old bread that needed to be given away before it spoiled. These acts of kindness hadn't been calculated or strategic. They'd emerged naturally from a part of herself she'd thought had been permanently buried. But they'd also created complications. The more invested she became in her community, the more she had to lose. The more people who depended on her, the greater the risk of her past catching up with her present. She'd had close calls over the years. A journalist investigating war crimes had asked too many questions about her background. A former military contractor had claimed to recognize her from a distance, though he'd been too intoxicated to trust his memory. Most troubling had been the arrival, 3 years ago, of a new priest to replace Father Miguel's predecessor, a younger man who'd served as a military chaplain and who'd looked at her with the penetrating gaze of someone trained to read people. But Father Miguel Santos, despite his military background, had proven to be different from what she'd expected. Instead of suspicion, he'd shown only acceptance. Instead of judgment, he'd offered friendship. Their conversations had gradually moved from pleasantries to deeper discussions about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of genuine change. "I've always believed," he'd told her one evening as she'd closed the bakery, "that God judges us not by our past, but by what we choose to do with the gifts we've been given. You feed people, Margot. You create joy. Whatever came before, this is what matters now." His words had been a balm to wounds she'd thought would never heal. But they'd also created a new kind of pressure. If she truly was a different person now, if her past really could be transcended, then what did that mean? For moments like this one, when the old skills might be necessary to protect the new life she'd built. As she'd positioned herself at the window, adjusting her stance to account for the morning breeze that carried the scent of jasmine from the courtyard below, Margot had found herself thinking about Tommy's birthday cake. She'd spent 3 hours the night before creating those buttercream roses, each petal shaped with the same precision she now applied to calculating windage and elevation. The irony wasn't lost on her. The steady hands that could create beauty were the same, ones that could deal death with surgical precision. But perhaps that wasn't irony at all. Perhaps it was simply the duality that existed within every human being, the capacity for both creation and destruction, for both tenderness and ruthless effectiveness. Perhaps the real question wasn't whether she was Margot the baker or Margaret the sniper, but whether she could be both without losing her soul in the process. Through her scope, she could see the enemy sniper clearly now. Young, maybe mid-20s, with the controlled movements of someone professionally trained, but not yet seasoned by years of experience. His rifle was military grade, but not top tier. His position well chosen, but not perfect. He was good, but he wasn't exceptional. More importantly, he was targeting civilians. Not military installations, not government buildings, not strategic infrastructure. He was attempting to terrorize a neighborhood where children played and families struggled to maintain some semblance of normal life. That made the decision easier. Margot had killed before, many times, but always with clear parameters and specific objectives. This felt different. This was personal in a way her previous work had never been. These weren't faceless targets in a geopolitical game. They were her friends, her chosen family, the people who'd helped her become someone she could live with. Being she thought of Elena, still pressed against the clinic wall, probably calculating how many patients she'd lose if the shooting continued. She thought of Tommy, likely still frozen with his birthday cake. The Sweet 16 celebration he'd been looking forward to turned into a nightmare. She thought of Father Miguel, who believed in redemption and second chances and the possibility that people could genuinely change. As she aligned her crosshairs and began the slow, steady exhale that would precede her shot, Margot made a promise to herself. She would do what needed to be done to protect her community, but she wouldn't let this moment define her. She wouldn't let the necessity of violence erase the 15 years of peace she'd built. She would be Margaret one-shot Beaumont for as long as necessary, but she would remain Margot the baker in her heart. The shot, when it came, was perfect. The silence that followed Margot's shot was profound and temporary. For exactly 7 seconds, the neighborhood held its breath, caught between disbelief and hope. Then reality crashed back like a wave, bringing with it sirens, shouts, and the thunderous approach of military vehicles that had been monitoring the sniper activity from positions throughout the city. Tommy Castellano was the first to move, his young legs carrying him toward the bakery with the reckless bravery of someone who'd never fully grasped his own mortality. His birthday cake lay forgotten on the sidewalk, its pristine white box now scattered and stained with dust from the mornings. "Violence, Mrs. Beaumont," he called out, his voice cracking with adrenaline and fear. "Mrs. Beaumont, are you okay?" Margot descended from her elevated position with mechanical precision, her hands already working to disassemble and conceal the rifle that had just saved lives. But as she reached the main floor of the bakery, she realized that concealment was no longer possible. Through the shattered front window, she could see a crowd gathering, not just neighbors and customers, but soldiers, police officers, and the sharp-eyed civilians who always materialized when violence erupted in populated areas. Dr. Elena Vasquez was the first to reach the bakery, her medical training overriding her caution as she pushed through the broken door to check for casualties. What she found instead was Margot standing calmly behind the counter, her flour-dusted apron now bearing traces of dust and debris, her expression unreadable. "The sniper?" Elena asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. The answer: Neutralized, Margot replied, the clinical term slipping out before she could stop it. She saw Elena's eyebrows rise slightly at the professional terminology, but the doctor simply nodded and began checking the bakery for anyone who might need medical attention. Father Miguel arrived next, his black robes billowing as he hurried through the crowd that was rapidly forming outside. His eyes took in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who'd ministered to communities in crisis for decades. The precise nature of the counter-sniper response, the calm demeanor of the bakery's owner, the way Margot's hands showed no trembling despite having been in a life-threatening situation moments before. "Remarkable," he said quietly, ostensibly referring to everyone's survival. But his gaze lingered on Margot with new understanding. The first military official to enter the bakery was Captain Rodriguez, a career officer whose weathered face spoke of decades spent navigating the complex realities of urban warfare. He moved through the space methodically, noting details with the thoroughness of someone conducting an investigation rather than a rescue operation. "Ma'am," he addressed Margot formally, "I'm Captain Rodriguez with the 3rd Infantry Division. We've been tracking sniper activity in this area for the past week. Can you tell me what you observed during the incident?" Margot's response was carefully measured. "I heard the first shots around 6:17. I took cover behind the counter and remained there until the shooting stopped." The lie came easily, smoothed by years of practice and necessity, but Captain Rodriguez wasn't easily dismissed. His eyes scanned the bakery's interior, noting the defensive positions, the clear sight lines to upper floors, the fact that Margot showed none of the shock or disorientation typical of civilian shooting victims. The sniper was eliminated by a single shot too. "The head from approximately 400 meters, he said conversationally. "Exceptional marksmanship, especially considering the wind conditions and elevated angle." "How fortunate," Margot replied, her voice betraying nothing. "Indeed, we're canvassing the area for the shooter. Professional work like this doesn't happen." By accident, Rodriguez paused, studying her face. "You wouldn't happen to know of any former military personnel in the neighborhood? Someone with advanced training?" Before Margot could answer, Tommy burst through the crowd that had gathered at the bakery's entrance. His young face was flushed with excitement and something approaching hero worship. It was Mrs. Beaumont, he announced to anyone within earshot. "I saw her go upstairs right after the shooting started, and then the bad guy stopped shooting." The silence that followed Tommy's proclamation was deafening. Every eye in the bakery turned toward Margot, whose carefully maintained facade finally showed the first cracks. Captain Rodriguez's expression shifted from professional curiosity to sharp interest. "Is that so?" Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." But privacy was no longer an option. Word of Tommy's revelation spread through the crowd with the speed of wildfire. And within minutes, the narrative had transformed from mysterious sniper saves neighborhood to the baker is secretly a soldier. The implications rippled outward like concentric circles, touching every relationship Margot had built over the past 15 years. Mrs. Chun was among the first to grasp the full significance of what had been revealed. The elderly woman who'd spent months teaching Margot to make mooncakes now stared at her with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. "You saved us," she said simply, but her eyes held questions that had no easy answers. The arrival of Lieutenant Sarah Hayes complicated matters further. Hayes was a military intelligence officer whose job was to investigate irregular military activities in civilian areas. Unlike Captain Rodriguez, whose focus was tactical, Hayes was interested in the broader implications of finding a world-class sniper operating from a neighborhood bakery. "Margaret Beaumont," Hayes said, consulting a tablet that seemed to contain information Margot hadn't expected anyone to have. "Though I suspect that wasn't always your name." The use of her full first name sent a chill through Margot's spine. In 15 years, no one in Levant had called her anything but Margot. The formal name belonged to a different person, a different life, a different set of loyalties and obligations. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Margot replied, but her voice had lost some of its steadiness. "I'm not implying anything," Hayes said calmly. "I'm stating facts. The shot that eliminated the sniper this morning came from this building. The precision and technique suggest military training at the highest level. And you, the building's owner and sole occupant, display behavioral patterns consistent with someone who's received extensive combat instruction." Dr. Vasquez, who'd been quietly observing the exchange while treating minor cuts from flying glass, stepped forward with the protective instincts of someone who'd grown to care deeply for her mourning companion. "Even if what you're suggesting is true, Lieutenant, Mrs. Beaumont saved lives today. This neighborhood has been under threat for weeks." "I'm not questioning the outcome," Hayes replied. "I'm questioning the methodology. Civilian vigilantism, even by someone with military training, falls outside legal parameters for engagement in active combat zones." Father Miguel's voice carried across the bakery with the authority of moral conviction. "She protected the innocent. Surely that counts for something in any legal or ethical framework." But Hayes wasn't interested in philosophical debates. Her job was to maintain operational security in a region where the lines between civilian and military, friend and enemy, were increasingly blurred. A rogue sniper, no matter how well-intentioned, represented a variable that couldn't be controlled or predicted. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me for debriefing," Hayes said to Margot. "This isn't an arrest, but it's not optional." The crowd that had gathered outside the bakery was growing larger and more agitated. News of the morning's events had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood, drawing spectators, reporters, and various officials whose interest in the situation ranged from professional to purely curious. Signs began appearing among the crowd, some supporting Margot as a hero, others demanding answers about her true identity and background. Maria Santos, Father Miguel's niece, pushed through the crowd with the determination of someone defending family. At 19, she possessed both the fearlessness of youth and the loyalty that comes from being genuinely cared for by someone. "You can't take her," she announced to Lieutenant Hayes. "She makes our birthday cakes. She gives food to families who can't pay. She's one of us." "That may be true," Hayes replied patiently, "but it doesn't change the legal realities of the situation." Tommy, still shaken by the morning's events, but unwilling to see his benefactor punished for saving lives, stepped forward with the righteous indignation of a teenager who'd witnessed injustice. "This is stupid," he declared. "She stopped the bad guy. She kept us safe. Why are you treating her like she's the criminal?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the central contradiction of the situation. Margot had indeed saved lives, had protected innocent civilians from a deadly threat. But she'd done so using skills and equipment that raised uncomfortable questions about her past and her true nature. Captain Rodriguez, who'd been observing the exchange with growing concern, finally intervened. "Lieutenant, perhaps we could conduct this debriefing here in the presence of community representatives. Given the neighborhood's obvious investment in this situation, a heavy-handed approach might create more problems than it solves." Hayes considered this suggestion, weighing operational requirements against public relations concerns. The crowd outside was becoming more vocal, and removing Margot forcibly would likely create the kind of incident that attracted unwanted attention from higher authorities and media outlets. "Very well," she agreed reluctantly. "But I want this area cleared of non-essential personnel, and I want complete transparency regarding any military equipment or training that may be involved." As the crowd was reluctantly dispersed by military police, leaving only Margot, the key officials, and a handful of community leaders inside the bakery, the real interrogation began. Hayes had prepared thoroughly for this conversation, armed. with questions that probed not just the morning's events, but the 15 years of careful identity construction that had preceded them. "Let's start with the basics," Hayes said, settling into a chair that Tommy had provided. "What was your military occupation specialty?" Margot's hesitation was almost imperceptible, but Father Miguel caught it. The priest who believed in redemption. And second chances found himself wondering exactly what kind of second chance he'd been supporting all these years. "Scout sniper," Margot replied quietly. "Marine Corps. Duration of service?" 8 years active duty. 2 years reserves. "Unit." "Assignments?" This question carried more weight than the others. Unit assignments could reveal operational deployments, classified missions, and the kind of combat experience that produced shooters, capable of 400-meter headshots in urban environments. "Various," Margot said, her answer deliberately vague. Hayes consulted her tablet again. "Force reconnaissance. 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit. Multiple deployments to classified locations between 2001 and 2009. Specialized in long-range reconnaissance and precision elimination of high-value targets." Each revelation hit the gathered community leaders like a physical blow. The gentle woman who'd made their children's birthday cakes, who'd listened to their problems and offered comfort during the darkest days of the conflict, had been trained. As one of the military's most elite killers, Dr. Vasquez was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "How many?" "How many what?" Margot asked, though she knew exactly what Elena was asking. "How many people did you kill before you came here?" The question that everyone wanted answered hung in the air like smoke. Margot looked around the bakery, seeing 15 years of relationships suddenly viewed through a different lens. These people had trusted her, had welcomed her into their lives, had allowed her to become part of their families. They deserved honesty, even if that honesty destroyed everything she'd built. 43 confirmed kills, she said finally. Over 8 years of active service. The number seemed to echo in the small space, carrying with it the weight of lives ended and futures erased. Father Miguel's hand moved unconsciously to the wooden cross at his chest, while Mrs. Chun stared at Margot with eyes that held a new kind of understanding. "And since coming to Levant?" Hayes pressed. "0, until this morning." "Why?" Tommy asked, his young voice cutting through the official interrogation with genuine curiosity. "Why did you stop?" It was the question that mattered most, the one that could determine whether Margot was viewed as a reformed killer trying to build a peaceful life or a dangerous operative maintaining deep cover in a civilian community. Margot's answer came slowly, shaped by 15 years of self-reflection and the gradual understanding that redemption was possible, even for someone with her background. "Because I got tired of taking life," she said. "I wanted to try creating it instead." Lieutenant Hayes's investigation uncovered layers of complexity that transformed the morning's incident from a simple act of heroism into something far more nuanced and troubling. As military personnel swept through the bakery's upper floors and discovered the hidden chamber with its cache of equipment, the scope of Margot's deception became clear to everyone present. The revelation that their neighborhood baker had maintained an operational safe house complete with military-grade communications equipment, detailed maps of the city's strategic locations, and enough ammunition to supply a small squad changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. What had seemed like a spontaneous act of community defense now appeared to be the activation of a carefully maintained military asset. Captain Rodriguez examined the hidden room with professional appreciation, noting the sophisticated surveillance capabilities and the meticulous maintenance of equipment that hadn't been used in over a decade. "This isn't amateur hour," he commented to Hayes. "This is a professional-grade installation. Someone with serious backing and long-term objectives." Dr. Vasquez, who'd been permitted to remain as a community representative, stared at the revealed arsenal with growing disbelief. The woman who'd shared morning coffee with her for years, who'd patiently listened to stories about difficult patients and medical challenges, who'd created elaborate cakes for the clinic's staff celebrations, had been living a double life of extraordinary complexity. "I need to understand," Alina said, addressing Margot directly. "All those mornings we talked, all those times you listened to me complain about hospital politics and difficult cases, were you gathering intelligence? Was any of it real?" The pain in Elena's voice cut through Margot more deeply than any official interrogation could have. These weren't professional relationships that could be compartmentalized and analyzed. These were genuine friendships built over years of shared experiences, and the possibility that they might have been fabricated or manipulated struck at the heart of everything Margot had come to value. "It was all real," Margot replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "Every conversation, every shared moment, every cake I made for your daughter's birthday, all of it was real. The equipment upstairs was ... insurance, a precaution I hoped I'd never need to use." Father Miguel, who'd been studying the communications device with the keen interest of someone who'd served as a military chaplain, looked up from the equipment. "These aren't standard civilian radio frequencies. Some of this equipment is designed to interface with classified military networks." Hayes nodded grimly. "Which raises questions about ongoing affiliations and current operational status. Margaret, I need to know, are you still connected to any active military or intelligence operations?" The question everyone had been dreading finally hung in the air. If Margot was revealed to be an active intelligence asset, it would cast doubt on every relationship she'd built, every act of kindness she'd performed, every moment of genuine connection she'd shared with her adopted community. "No," Margot said firmly. "I've had no contact with any military or intelligence organization since 2009. The equipment upstairs was maintained as a personal security measure, nothing more." But Hayes wasn't satisfied with simple denials. Her tablet revealed information that painted a more complex picture. According to classified records, Margaret Beaumont was reported killed in action during a mission in Afghanistan in 2009. Yet here you are, very much alive, operating under your real name in a conflict zone. That suggests either extremely sophisticated identity manipulation or ongoing support from classified sources. The revelation that Margot's official death had been faked sent shockwaves through the assembled group. Tommy, who'd been listening with the intense focus of someone trying to understand how his simple world had become so complicated, spoke up with the directness of youth. "You mean she's supposed to be dead? Like, officially dead?" "According to military records, yes," Hayes confirmed. "Which means someone with significant authority arranged for her to disappear from official records while maintaining her ability to operate under her real identity." Mrs. Chun, who'd been silent throughout much of the interrogation, finally spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through multiple conflicts and understood the complex loyalties they created. During war, many people must choose between official truth and survival truth. Sometimes these are not same thing. Her words carried weight because everyone in the room understood the reality of living in a war zone. Survival often required compromises, deceptions, and allegiances that couldn't be easily categorized as right or wrong. But the scale of Margot's deception was beyond anything they'd imagined. Father Miguel approached Margot with the gentle directness he used when ministering to parishioners carrying heavy burdens. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, not as the baker we've known, but as the soldier you were. Have your actions here, over these 15 years, ever put this community at risk?" It was the question that cut to the heart of everyone's concerns. Had Margot's presence in their neighborhood made them targets? Had her hidden identity attracted the kind of attention that brought sniper attacks and military investigations? Margot's answer came after a long pause, during which she seemed to weigh not just her words, but the accumulated weight of 15 years of careful choices. I chose this location because it was far from strategic targets, because it was a place where I could build something peaceful without endangering anyone. The attack this morning wasn't connected to my presence here. It was part of the broader conflict that's been tearing this city apart for years. Lieutenant Hayes consulted her tablet again, cross-referencing intelligence reports with the morning's events. The sniper who targeted this area was identified as Alexei Petrov, a Chechen operative working with separatist forces. His mission was to create civilian terror in government-controlled neighborhoods. This attack appears to have been random rather than targeted. The confirmation that the morning's violence hadn't been connected to Margot's presence provided some relief, but it didn't address the larger questions about trust, identity, and the nature of the relationship she'd built under false pretenses. Dr. Vasquez, who'd been processing the revelations with the analytical mind of someone trained to diagnose complex conditions, posed the question that everyone was thinking. So who are you, really? Are you Margot the baker who's become part of our family, or are you Margaret the soldier who's been hiding among us? Before Margot could answer, Tommy stepped forward with the loyalty of someone whose life had been directly impacted by her kindness. "She's both," he said simply. "She made my birthday cake last night, and she saved my life this morning. Maybe people can be more than one thing." His words carried the simple wisdom of youth, uncomplicated by the adult tendency to categorize people into neat, understandable boxes. But the adults in the room struggled with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the gentle, nurturing woman they'd known with the trained killer she'd revealed herself to be. Maria Santos, Father Miguel's niece, had been silent throughout most of the interrogation, but now she spoke with the passionate conviction of someone defending family. "I don't care what she used to be. I care about what she's done for us. When my grandmother was sick last winter, Mrs. Beaumont brought soup every day for 2 weeks. When the Kowalski family lost their apartment to shelling, she let them stay in the back room of the bakery for a month. When children couldn't afford birthday cakes, she made them anyway and pretended it was leftover inventory." Each example Maria cited was a small act of kindness that had accumulated over 15 years, creating a pattern of behavior that spoke to character and genuine care for community welfare. But they also highlighted the central paradox of Margot's situation. Could someone trained to kill with surgical precision genuinely transform into someone whose primary instinct was to nurture and protect? Captain Rodriguez, who'd been observing the community dynamics with professional interest, finally offered his perspective. "I've seen a lot of soldiers transition out of active duty. Some adapt well to civilian life, others struggle with the adjustment. But I've never seen someone maintain operational capabilities while building such deep civilian relationships. It suggests either remarkable compartmentalization or genuine psychological transformation." The assessment was clinical, but not unsympathetic. Rodriguez understood the challenges faced by soldiers attempting to build peaceful lives after years of combat, and his observation suggested respect for what Margot had accomplished, even as he acknowledged its unprecedented nature. Lieutenant Hayes, however, remained focused on security implications rather than psychological assessments. Regardless of personal transformation, we have a situation where a highly trained operative has maintained an active safe house in a civilian area for 15 years. That represents a security vulnerability that needs to be addressed. "What does that mean exactly?" Father Miguel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "It means Margaret Beaumont cannot continue to operate in this capacity in this location," Hayes replied. "The equipment will be confiscated, the safe house will be sealed, and she need to submit to regular monitoring to ensure she doesn't represent an ongoing security risk." The pronouncement fell like a death sentence on the assembled community representatives. For 15 years, the bakery had been more than a business. It had been a gathering place, a source of comfort, a symbol of continuity in a world constantly threatened by violence. The idea of losing Margot, felt like losing a family member. Mrs. Chen was the first to protest, her elderly voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived multiple conflicts and understood the value of stability. This woman has done nothing wrong. She protects us, feeds us, cares for us. You punish her for being good neighbor? Tommy joined the protest with the passionate intensity of youth. This is crazy. She saved our lives. Why are you treating her like the bad guy? But Hayes remained unmoved by emotional appeals. Her job was to maintain security, not to weigh the social value of individual relationships against potential military risks. I understand your attachment to Mrs. Beaumont, but my responsibilities extend beyond this neighborhood. I have to consider broader implications. Dr. Vasquez, who'd been listening to the exchange with growing frustration, finally spoke with the controlled anger of someone who dedicated her life to healing and couldn't understand why good intentions were being punished. So what you're telling us is that after 15 years of contributing to this community, after saving lives this morning, Margaret is going to be treated as a threat rather than a hero? I'm telling you that the situation is complex and requires careful handling, Hayes replied. There are protocols that must be followed. Father Miguel, who'd spent decades navigating the intersection of moral imperatives and practical realities, stepped forward with the diplomatic skills he'd developed as a military chaplain. Lieutenant, surely there must be some middle ground. Some way to acknowledge both the security concerns and the genuine value Margaret has brought to this community. It was Captain Rodriguez who suggested a potential solution. As a career officer who dealt with similar situations in other conflict zones, he understood that rigid adherence to protocol sometimes created more problems than it solved. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. What if we established a formal community liaison program? He proposed. Margaret could continue her civilian activities under official oversight, while also serving as a security consultant for neighborhood protection. Her skills would be utilized in a controlled, transparent way that addresses both security concerns and community needs. The suggestion offered a potential path forward that neither completely vindicated nor completely condemned Margot's actions. It acknowledged her value while addressing legitimate security concerns, and it provided a framework for moving forward that didn't require destroying the relationship she'd built over 15 years. Lieutenant Hayes considered the proposal, weighing it against her operational requirements and the political realities of the situation. A heavy-handed approach that alienated an entire neighborhood could create more security problems than it solved, especially if it turned a valuable asset into a source of local resentment. It would require extensive documentation and regular reporting, she said finally. And it would mean operating under official oversight rather than independently. Margot, who'd been listening to her fate being debated by others, finally spoke. For herself, I accept those conditions if it means I can continue to serve this community. The formal agreement represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but provided a workable solution for everyone involved. Margot would continue operating the bakery under official military oversight, would serve as an informal security consultant for the neighborhood, and would submit to regular monitoring to ensure she posed no ongoing security risk. But the revelations of the morning had fundamentally changed the dynamics of every relationship she'd built. Trust, once shattered, couldn't be easily repaired, even when good intentions were acknowledged and formal accommodations were made. As the military personnel began the process of cataloging and securing the equipment from the hidden safe house, the community leaders who defended Margot found themselves grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How do you reconcile caring for someone with discovering they've hidden fundamental aspects of their identity? How do you move forward when the foundation of trust has been shaken, even if the relationship itself remains valuable? Tommy, with the resilience of youth, seemed least affected by the revelations. "So Mrs. Beaumont is like a secret agent, Baker," he said to Maria as they watched military technicians carrying equipment out of the building. "That's actually pretty cool." But the adults understood that the situation was far more complex than Tommy's simple assessment suggested. The path forward would require rebuilding trust, establishing new ground rules for their relationships, and learning to accept that people could be more complicated than they initially appeared. 6 months after the morning that changed everything, the neighborhood around Margot's bakery had evolved into something unprecedented in the conflict-torn city of Levant. What had begun as a simple community gathering place had transformed into an officially recognized, protected civilian zone, with Margot serving as both its unofficial guardian and its primary provider of normalcy. The formal arrangement negotiated between Lieutenant Hayes and the community had proven more successful than anyone had anticipated. Under the new structure, Margot continued her baking operations while also providing security consultation for the neighborhood's protection. Her expert knowledge of tactical situations, combined with her deep understanding of the community's needs, had created a model that military officials were considering implementing in other areas of the city. The morning routine at the bakery had evolved to accommodate the new realities. Margot still rose at 4 a.m. to begin her bread preparation, but now her activities were coordinated with a small military liaison team that monitored the area's security status. Captain Rodriguez, who'd taken personal responsibility for the program's success, had become a regular presence in the neighborhood, often stopping by for coffee and strategic discussions that seamlessly blended with the bakery's normal social. ATMOSPHER, Dr. Elena Vasquez had been among the first to fully embrace the new dynamic. Her initial shock at discovering Margot's background had given way to appreciation for the enhanced security that her friend's presence provided. The clinic next door now operated under the informal protection of someone whose professional assessment of threats was rarely wrong, and the result had been a significant reduction in the random violence that had previously plagued the area. "You know what's interesting?" Elena said one morning as she collected her usual pain au chocolate and double espresso. "I've been thinking about all those times you seemed to know exactly when it was safe to walk home from late shifts, or when I should take different routes to avoid trouble areas. I thought you were just naturally cautious, but you were actually reading tactical situations the whole time." Margot smiled as she packaged Elena's order, their friendship having found a new equilibrium that acknowledged both past deceptions and ongoing trust. "I couldn't protect you without revealing who I was, so I tried to guide you towards safer choices. It wasn't perfect, but it was what I could do at the time." The conversation reflected a broader pattern of adjustment that had occurred throughout the community. People had gradually come to terms with the revelation that their gentle baker possessed skills that went far beyond pastry decoration, and many had begun to appreciate the additional layer of security her presence provided. Tommy Castellano, now 17 and working part-time at the bakery while finishing his education, had become something of a local celebrity as the young man who'd inadvertently revealed the neighborhood's secret protector. His birthday cake, destroyed during the morning of the sniper attack, had been replaced with an even more elaborate creation that had become the centerpiece of a community celebration marking the area's new status as a protected zone. "Mrs. Beaumont," Tommy said one afternoon as he helped arrange fresh pastries in the display case, "do you think you'll ever tell us about the missions you went on before you came here?" Margot considered the question carefully. In the months since her background had been revealed, she'd been asked variations of this question many times. People were naturally curious about the experiences that had shaped someone capable of the morning's heroic intervention, but she remained reluctant to share details that belonged to a different life and a different version of herself. "Some stories are better left in the past," she replied gently. What matters is what we build moving forward. But Tommy's curiosity reflected a broader community interest in understanding how someone could successfully transition from a life of violence to one of nurturing and creation. Father Miguel had incorporated this theme into several sermons, exploring the theological implications of redemption and transformation, while Dr. Vasquez had begun collaborating with military psychologists to study the factors that enabled successful reintegration of combat veterans into civilian communities. The formal security arrangement had also attracted attention from higher military authorities who were struggling with similar challenges throughout the region. General Patricia Morrison, the commanding officer responsible for civilian protection operations in the broader metropolitan area, had visited the neighborhood twice to observe the program's implementation and assess its potential for broader application. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable," General Morrison told Margot during her second visit, as they walked through streets that showed visible signs of increased prosperity and stability. "We're seeing reduced civilian casualties, improved community cooperation with security forces, and economic growth that's unusual for areas this close to active conflict zones." The general's assessment was supported by measurable data. Crime rates in the neighborhood had dropped by 60% since the program's implementation. Small businesses were reopening, families were returning from refugee situations, and children were attending school with regularity that hadn't been seen in years. The bakery itself had expanded its operations, hiring 3 additional employees and serving as an anchor for broader economic recovery. Mrs. Chen had been instrumental in facilitating this growth, using her connections with other business owners to encourage investment in the area. Her initial uncertainty about Margot's revealed background had evolved into pride in having recognized the baker's exceptional character before her military background was known. "I told you she had steady hands," Mrs. Chen said to anyone who would listen. "Steady hands, good heart. This combination is rare." The elderly woman had also become an unofficial historian of the neighborhood's transformation, documenting the changes with photographs and written accounts that she hoped would serve as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Maria Santos had taken a different approach to processing the revelations about Margot. As someone studying journalism at the local university, she'd begun working on a comprehensive article about civilian-military cooperation in urban conflict zones, using the bakery program as her primary case study. "What fascinates me," Maria explained to her uncle, Father Miguel, "is how Aunt Margot managed to maintain both identities simultaneously. She wasn't pretending to be someone else, she was genuinely becoming someone else, while maintaining the ability to access her previous skills when necessary." Father Miguel had been particularly intrigued by the theological implications of Margot's story. His sermons had begun exploring themes of identity, vocation, and the possibility of genuine personal transformation. The idea that someone could successfully transition from a profession focused on ending life to one dedicated to nurturing it had become a powerful metaphor for broader concepts of redemption and renewal. "Margaret represents something we rarely see in our world," he said during one Sunday service that had drawn visitors from throughout the city. "She embodies the possibility that our past does not have to define our future, that skills developed for destruction can be redirected toward creation, and that communities can be strengthened rather than weakened by embracing complexity in the people who serve them." The success of the program had also created new challenges. The neighborhood's increased stability had attracted refugees from other areas, straining resources and creating pressure to expand the protected zone model. Margot found herself consulting on security arrangements for adjacent areas, while also maintaining her primary responsibilities to the bakery and its immediate community. Lieutenant Hayes, who'd initially approached the situation with skepticism, had become one of the program's strongest advocates within military circles. Her reports highlighted the cost-effectiveness of community-based security models compared to traditional military occupation approaches, and she'd been promoted to captain partly based on her successful management of the unprecedented arrangement. Asterisk, the key insight, Hayes explained in a presentation to senior military officials, is that security and community development are not separate objectives. When you have someone who understands both tactical requirements and civilian needs, you can create solutions that address multiple challenges simultaneously. The program's success had also attracted international attention. Representatives from other conflict zones had visited to study the model, and academic researchers had begun documenting the factors that contributed to its effectiveness. Margot found herself reluctantly serving as a case study in successful veteran reintegration, though she insisted that her situation was unique and might not be easily replicated elsewhere. 1 year after the sniper incident, the neighborhood hosted a community celebration that served as both a festival and a testament to the transformation that had occurred. The event featured live music, local vendors, children's activities, and a special ceremony recognizing the various individuals who'd contributed to the area's renewal. Margot had insisted that the celebration focus on community achievements rather than individual recognition, but the event naturally centered around the bakery and its role as the neighborhood's heart. She'd prepared hundreds of pastries for the occasion, working for days to create elaborate displays that showcased both her artistic skills and her commitment to the community's happiness. As evening approached and the formal festivities wound down, Margot found herself standing in the bakery's doorway, watching children play in streets that had been dangerous just a year before. The sight filled her with a satisfaction that she'd never experienced during her military career, a sense of having created something lasting and positive. Dr. Vasquez joined her in the doorway, holding a glass of wine from the community celebration. "Any regrets?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Margot considered the question seriously. The past year had been challenging in ways that combat never was. Building trust required a different kind of courage than facing enemy fire, and the emotional complexity of maintaining relationships while revealing difficult truths had tested her in unexpected ways. "No regrets," she said finally. "This is who I was meant to become." Tommy appeared beside them, carrying a slice of the anniversary cake that had become the celebration centerpiece. At 18, he'd grown into a young man whose confidence and optimism reflected the stability that had characterized his recent years. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said, "I've been thinking about what I want to do after graduation. I want to study conflict resolution and community development. I want to help other places become like this." His words represented the ultimate validation of everything Margot had worked to build. The young man who'd once lived in fear, whose birthday celebration had been interrupted by violence, was now planning a career dedicated to creating the kind of safety and stability he'd experienced in his own neighborhood. As the last visitors departed and the bakery returned to its normal evening quiet, Margot began the familiar routine of cleaning and preparation for the next day's baking. But now these activities carried additional meaning. Each loaf of bread represented not just sustenance, but stability. Each decorated cake symbolized not just celebration, but hope. Each morning's opening of the bakery doors was both a continuation of routine and an affirmation that peaceful, normal life was possible, even in the midst of conflict. The hidden chamber upstairs had been permanently sealed, its equipment relocated to official military facilities. But the skills and instincts it represented remained available when needed, now channeled through official structures that made them assets for community protection rather than secrets that created distance and mistrust. As she locked the bakery's front door and turned off the lights, Margot reflected on the journey that had brought her from Margaret "One-Shot" Beaumont, elite sniper, to Margot the baker, community anchor. The transition hadn't erased her past or eliminated her capacity for violence when necessary. Instead, It had demonstrated that identity could be more fluid and redemption more achievable than she'd ever imagined possible. The neighborhood slept peacefully around her, protected by both official security measures and the watchful presence of someone who'd learned to value creation over destruction, community over isolation, and hope over despair. 3 years later, the model developed around Margot's bakery had been implemented in 12 neighborhoods across Levant, with similar programs being tested in 3 other conflict zones internationally. The Integrated Community Security Initiative had become a standard approach for military planners dealing with urban civilian protection, though none of the other implementations had achieved quite the same level of success as the original. Dr. Elena Vasquez had completed her medical degree and opened a second clinic in an adjacent neighborhood, using principles of community-integrated healthcare that paralleled the security model. She'd maintained her morning routine of coffee and pastries at the bakery, though their conversations now included discussions of policy implementation and program expansion that would have been unimaginable during their early, simple exchanges about patient care. The medical journal wants to publish our paper on trauma treatment in community-integrated environments, Elena mentioned one morning as she reviewed research notes over her usual breakfast. They're particularly interested in the psychological benefits of having security personnel who are also community members. Margot nodded as she arranged fresh croissants, her movements showing the accumulated confidence of someone who'd found perfect balance between her various roles and responsibilities. It makes sense. People heal better when they feel safe, and they feel safer when they trust the people protecting them. The observation reflected insights that had been codified into training programs for military personnel transitioning to civilian protection roles. Margot had reluctantly agreed to serve as a consultant for these programs, though she insisted that her situation was unique and cautioned against assuming that all combat veterans could successfully make similar transitions. Tommy Castellano had indeed pursued studies in conflict resolution and community development, earning a scholarship to attend university in the capital city. But he'd chosen to return to the neighborhood for his thesis research, documenting the long-term effects of the integrated security model on community development and social cohesion. What I'm finding, Tommy explained during one of his research interviews with Margot, is that the program's success wasn't just about having someone with military skills in a civilian role. It was about having someone who genuinely cared about the community and was willing to sacrifice personal privacy for collective safety. His analysis had identified factors that military planners were incorporating into selection criteria for personnel assigned to similar programs. The combination of technical competence, emotional intelligence, and genuine commitment to community welfare had proven difficult to replicate artificially, but understanding its components had improved training protocols significantly. Father Miguel Santos had been promoted to regional coordinator for faith-based community development initiatives, a role that allowed him to share the theological insights he'd developed through observing Margot's transformation. His sermons about redemption and identity had been collected into a book that was being used in seminary programs throughout the region. Margaret's story teaches us that divine grace can work through the most unexpected instruments, he wrote in the book's introduction. Sometimes the people best equipped to protect life are those who have learned, through hard experience, exactly how precious and fragile it truly is. The theological framework he developed around Margot's story had influenced broader discussions about veteran reintegration and the moral complexities of post-conflict societies. His work suggested that communities had responsibilities not just to support returning veterans, but to create opportunities for their unique skills to be channeled toward constructive purposes. Mrs. Chun had passed away peacefully in her sleep 18 months after the sniper incident, but not before seeing her neighborhood transform into something that exceeded her fondest hopes. Her final project had been a community garden that occupied a lot that had previously been too dangerous to develop, and her funeral had been attended by over 200 people, whose lives had been touched by her wisdom and kindness. Margot had created a special memorial cake for Mrs. Chun's funeral, a traditional Chinese design that incorporated mooncake elements with French pastry techniques, symbolizing the cultural exchange that had characterized their friendship. The recipe had become a permanent addition to the bakery's menu, ensuring that Mrs. Chun's influence would continue to nourish the community she'd helped build. Maria Santos had completed her journalism degree and taken a position with an international news organization, specializing in coverage of post-conflict reconstruction and community development. Her original article about the bakery program had been translated into 6 languages and had influenced policy discussions in multiple countries dealing with similar challenges. Aunt Margot taught me that the most important stories are often about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Maria had written in her award-winning series on civilian-military cooperation. But she also taught me that what looks extraordinary from the outside often feels like simply doing what needs to be done when you care deeply about the people around you. Her reporting had helped establish professional standards for journalism in post-conflict environments, emphasizing the importance of understanding community dynamics rather than simply documenting dramatic events. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to colonel and given responsibility for implementing community security programs throughout the regional command structure. His success with the bakery program had established his reputation as an innovative thinker capable of developing solutions that addressed both military objectives and civilian needs. A key insight, Rodriguez had explained in his presentations to international military audiences, is that security and community development are not sequential processes. They must occur simultaneously, with each reinforcing the other. Margot Beaumont demonstrated that this integration is possible when you have personnel who understand both domains. His work had influenced NATO doctrine on civilian protection in urban environments, and he'd been selected to lead a multinational task force developing best practices for community-integrated security operations. Lieutenant Hayes, now Major Hayes, had become the military's leading expert on civilian-military integration in conflict zones. Her doctoral dissertation on community assets in urban security operations had used the bakery program as its primary case study, and her research had established academic frameworks that were being taught in military academies worldwide. What Margaret accomplished was to demonstrate that identity is not fixed, Hayes had written in her conclusions. Military personnel can successfully transition to civilian roles without losing their professional competence, and communities can benefit from having protectors who are also neighbors, friends, and invested stakeholders in local prosperity. 5 years after the sniper incident, Margot received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Morrison, now retired from active duty and serving as director of a foundation focused on veteran reintegration, had come to discuss a proposal that would formalize Margot's role in training programs for military personnel transitioning to civilian protection duties. "We want to establish a training center here," General Morrison explained as they sat in the bakery's expanded dining area, which now accommodated the steady stream of visitors who came to observe the program's operations. "A place where active duty personnel can learn not just tactical skills, but community integration techniques. You'd be the primary instructor." Margot considered the proposal carefully. At 47, she'd found a balance between her various roles that felt sustainable and fulfilling. The bakery remained her primary identity and greatest source of satisfaction, but her consulting work had allowed her to influence positive change in other communities facing similar challenges. "I'd want to maintain the bakery," she said finally. "The baking isn't just cover or camouflage, it's who I've become." Any training program would need to understand that the civilian identity isn't secondary to the military skills. It's primary. The condition reflected her understanding that successful community integration required genuine commitment to civilian life rather than simply professional competence in military skills applied to civilian contexts. The distinction was subtle, but crucial, and it had become central to the training protocols that had developed around her example. 7 years after the morning that changed everything, the neighborhood around Margot's bakery had become a destination for researchers, policy makers, and community leaders from around the world. But it had also remained, fundamentally, a place where people lived normal lives with unusual security and stability. Children who'd been toddlers during the sniper incident were now attending secondary school with educational opportunities that had been unimaginable in previous years. Families had returned from refugee camps and rebuilt lives that incorporated both memories of displacement and hope for continued stability. Small businesses flourished under the protection of security measures that were visible enough to provide confidence but subtle enough to avoid creating an atmosphere of militarization. The bakery itself had expanded to employ 12 people, including refugees from other regions who'd learned both baking skills and community integration techniques that they could carry to other locations. Margot had developed training programs that taught not just pastry creation, but the social skills necessary to become community anchors in post-conflict environments. "What we're really teaching," she explained to the most recent group of trainees, "is how to become indispensable to a community in positive ways. When people depend on you for daily bread, birthday cakes, and morning coffee, you become part of their family. And when you're part of their family, protecting them becomes as natural as breathing." 10 years after the incident that revealed her background, Margot received recognition that she'd never expected or sought. The International Committee of the Red Cross awarded her their prize for humanitarian excellence, specifically citing her demonstration that individual transformation can catalyze community renewal, and that the skills of war can be successfully redirected toward the works of peace. The award ceremony, held in Geneva, brought together representatives from the 12 communities that had implemented versions of her model, along with military officials, academics, and policymakers who'd studied its effectiveness. But Margot insisted that any recognition belonged to the entire community that had made the transformation possible. "I provided technical skills," she said in her acceptance speech, "but the real work was done by neighbors who chose to trust rather than fear, to embrace complexity rather than demand simplicity, and to believe that people can change in fundamental ways. They took someone trained for war and helped her become an instrument of peace." The speech had been broadcast internationally and had influenced policy discussions about veteran reintegration and post-conflict reconstruction in dozens of countries. But its most important audience remained the community that had gathered in the bakery's dining room to watch the broadcast, celebrating not just Margot's recognition, but their collective achievement in creating something unprecedented and valuable. 15 years after purchasing a small bakery in a war-torn neighborhood, Margot stood in her kitchen at 4 a.m., beginning the familiar routine of bread preparation that had anchored every day of her transformed life. The city around her remained complex and challenging, but the immediate neighborhood had achieved a stability that served as proof that positive change was possible even in the most difficult circumstances. As she kneaded dough with hands that had learned to create rather than destroy, Margot reflected on the journey that had brought her from Margaret one-shot Beaumont to someone whose primary identity was bound up with nurturing and protecting the community that had become her chosen family. The hidden chamber upstairs remained sealed, its contents relocated to official facilities years ago. But the skills and instincts it had represented continued to serve her community, now channeled through official structures that made them assets for collective security rather than secrets that created distance and mistrust. At the morning's first customers would arrive in 2 hours, beginning another day of the ordinary interactions that had become the foundation of an extraordinary transformation. Dr. Vasquez would collect her pain au chocolate and double espresso while discussing her latest research into trauma treatment in community-integrated environments. Tommy, now Dr. Castellano and director of the neighborhood's community development initiative, would stop by for coffee before meetings with visiting delegations who came to study their model. Father Miguel would arrive for his bag of day-old bread for the expanded breakfast program that now served 3 orphanages, and they'd discuss the theological implications of identity, vocation, and the possibility of redemption that remained central to his ministry. Maria would call from her assignment covering post-conflict reconstruction in another region, sharing insights about how their model was being adapted to different cultural contexts. As the bread baked and filled the air with the scent of sustenance and stability, Margot prepared for another day of the life she'd built from the intersection of her past skills and her chosen values. Each loaf represented not just food, but security. Each decorated cake symbolized not just celebration, but hope. Each morning's opening of the bakery doors was both a continuation of routine and an affirmation that peaceful, normal life was achievable even in the most challenging circumstances. The woman who'd once been defined by her ability to eliminate targets with surgical precision had become someone whose primary skill was creating the conditions under which communities could flourish. The transformation hadn't erased her past or eliminated her capacity for violence when necessary. Instead, it had demonstrated that identity could be more fluid and redemption more achievable than anyone had imagined possible. As she unlocked the bakery's front door and turned on the lights to welcome the day's first customers, Margot embodied the possibility that people could change in fundamental ways, that skills developed for destruction could be redirected toward creation, and that communities could be strengthened rather than weakened by embracing complexity in the people who served them. The neighborhood stirred to life around her, protected by both official security measures and the watchful presence of someone who'd learned to value creation over destruction, community over isolation, and hope over despair. Children walked safely to school, families opened businesses with confidence in continued stability, and visitors arrived daily to study a model that proved positive change was possible even in the most challenging circumstances. In the kitchen of Margot's bakery, as Margaret Beaumont prepared another day's worth of sustenance for her chosen community, the scent of fresh bread carried the promise that transformation was possible, that redemption could be earned through service, and that the most powerful weapons in the fight for peace were patience, kindness, and the daily choice to create rather than destroy. The story of the baker who'd been a sniper had become legend throughout the region, but the woman herself remained focused on the simple, revolutionary act of making tomorrow better than today. One loaf of bread, one birthday cake, one act of community service at a time.